Alright, so now we're on to our last goal for this unit, and that is to describe the policies and actions of the U.S. government and how they impacted the affairs of the countries. So this is going to focus primarily on China and the area of Panama and the Panama Canal, and basically the political influence that led to the creation of the Panama Canal. Alright, so first let's talk about some other things that happened after the Spanish-American War, after the Philippine War. So the Japan-Russo War. So this is Russia versus Japan, and basically this is an imperialistic conflict because it's Japan wanting to take over some areas of Asia and Russia wanting those same areas, and so they basically went to war over it. So the peacemaker, oddly enough, ended up being Teddy Roosevelt. He got the country together and basically ended the conflict through diplomacy, which is a little strange for Roosevelt considering his view of war being sometimes a positive thing. Now, as a result of the negotiations and him ending the conflict, he actually won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906. Alright, so this is the U.S. view of Hawaiians, very negative. Again, we're talking about this idea of Hawaii in 1849, so it becomes a protectorate. It has native peoples there, it has their own kingdom and their own queen, and they are still looked at as very negatively. This is a very patronizing cartoon, makes the Hawaiian woman look very, very silly and basically just inferior to the soldiers holding her up, and that's the idea behind it. It's a very interesting little bit of history in Hawaii. It's good to research on your own, but for the most part in this class, just know that Hawaii was independent, and over time business interests and then eventually the American government took it over as protectorate. So first things first, in 1898 Hawaii officially became a territory during the Spanish-American War, which is convenient because we had to go to the Philippines, and Hawaii was a good staging ground for that. It had been under control of American businessmen since Queen Liliuokalani, the Queen of Hawaii, had tried to was always there, but basically businessmen took over as time went on with their interest, ability to acquire land, and during this time period in U.S. history, businessmen could basically hire their own private armies, so they could kind of just take over places much the way countries could. And by this point, in 1893, the U.S. had such influence over it that it became important for sugar production as a base for ports, all these various things. Hawaii is just a very, very convenient area because it's this sole island chain surrounded by nothing but water, so it's a great stop-off point. It's also the reason why the Japanese bombed it at Pearl Harbor was because of its strategic location. They wanted to basically take it out of commission for a while so that they could fight various places in the Pacific, because Japanese, their goal during World War II was to take over the Pacific Southeast. And there's a picture of the Queen. Alright, China and the open door policy. So, open door policy essentially means that it's open door, but there's a dual role here. So, much like Africa, much like Southeast Asia, there was a very good chance China might be taken over by various European interests and kind of divided up like we saw on those maps of Africa before, and get chunked up. The U.S. didn't want that to happen. Rather than let them chunk it up, the U.S. basically promoted an open door policy. John Hay was Secretary of State at the time. Basically said, let's make it so that everybody can access China, and that way we've preserved China's territorial integrity or their borders, and that way there's no fighting, there's no war, there's no conquest, it's just economics and trade. And so there's a political cartoon, the open door to China, basically letting everybody in, and if everybody has equal access, nobody fights, everybody reaps the benefits of trade with China for things like silk and other various items. Now, the United States, which had helped suppress the Boxer Rebellion, we'll talk about that in a little bit, now called for basically expanded open door policy. The idea was proposed that China remain independent, nominally, meaning not a real independence, but like an independence where they got to look like they had control, but really other state interests were taking over. The open door policy allowed for full trade with China. China had lost no control over its trading policies and had no real choice. So here's how that works. So they open up the doors and people go and trade. But that means that China has no choice of who comes in and trades. That's kind of how they lose their independence. So it's a very strange situation where they're actually creating a less free society, because China was notorious for walling itself off, quite literally sometimes, from outside influence. Even we're talking about like Genghis and Kublai Khan and various rulers throughout history, China was often closed off to where they were their own independent empire, and they kind of like left everybody else alone, and they made sure everybody left them alone. Now China is having its doors, quote unquote, opened up, which makes it sound positive. Really, they might not want that kind of trade and that kind of influence of other foreigners coming in, as evidenced by the Boxer Rebellion. Now again, quick review of spheres of influence. That's indirect control. So if you want to control somebody directly, you do it at the point of a gun, you do it with warships. Indirect control is often done with things like economics, money, things being thrown into different areas that require some kind of dependency. And that's what they started doing with China. They started investing in China so that China was more dependent on foreign powers. Like if someone from Germany invested millions of dollars, well, guess what? That means that China, to the extent that they're invested in, is dependent on German interests, which means they have less control over their own lives because they're dependent on those German or U.S. or French or English loans of money. And these are the spheres of influence. There's Japan's, France's, Britain's, Germany's, all their influence that's in China, especially with the various river basins. And here's a quick cartoon called A Fair Field and No Favor. Uncle Sam, I'm out for commerce, not conquest. And again, that's the idea. We don't want to tear up China and break it apart and let everybody just fight over it. We want everybody to have equal access. That way we can all reap the benefit of economics with China, sometimes very much to the negative impact of Chinese people. All right, so the Boxer Rebellion is kind of a reaction to this open door policy. And again, indirect control often means money. So there were some very xenophobic people who did not like foreigners, but there were Chinese folks that did not like foreigners being white Anglo-Saxon people coming in to basically take over through economics. They were called the Boxers by the West, the Europeans, because of their martial arts training. So like boxers, like fighters, well, they were martial artists. So they weren't really boxing, but it was still kind of like fighting. It lasts from November 1899 to September 1901. Now, the biggest areas of influence were trade, politics, religion, technology. They weren't really fighting with guns, they were fighting and taking over with influence, money, religion, all those things I just mentioned. The rebellion was put down by Great Britain, France, Germany, Japan, Russia, and the U.S. Also, the six big countries that had a great deal of investment in China. So they were the ones that put down the Boxer Rebellion, which effectively made the open door policy much more feasible. So here's an image of the Boxer Rebellion. The Boxers are the guys in red. And there's a company of boxers walking down a street in China. Now this is a very you might notice these if you have an old person in your family that might have one of these. This is a card that you would look at through what's called a stereopticon. It's a little device you hold up to your eyes and it makes it look like it's 3D. Very old little novelty device. I might show a picture of it one day. All right, the Panama Canal. If there is one thing you need to know about American imperialism and about the impact of it, know the Panama Canal. It was built between 1904 and 1914, so 10 years. The plan was endorsed by the President, Teddy Roosevelt, to connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. And basically helped us expand our military power, economic power. U.S. supported the Panamanian independence from Colombia. Really, this is a revolt that we supported so we could access Panama and get this canal built. We put down $10 million to Panama for the land and $250,000 in annual rent. The total cost ended up being around $375 million. So it was one of the biggest public works projects in almost world history when you get right down to it. So there's Teddy Roosevelt building the canal. That's not really how it happened. Just, there you go. So basically, we're talking about digging out an entire country. So this entire country, this isthmus is the technical geographic term for it, is going to have a canal cut through it with dynamite, drills, explosions, everything you need to blow up dirt. And this is what it actually looks like from a map perspective. So you have all these locks and downs, and we'll talk about what they are in just a minute. But this is the canal zone. This is where you basically come in from Balboa and you end up in Cologne when you leave. Now, the reason why this is important is because before this, you couldn't get through here. That's why you had to blow it up with all this dynamite and stuff. In US 1, we talk about the Erie Canal. This is very much the same kind of principle, but bigger. And there's Teddy Roosevelt in his white suit on a big old excavator. All right, so here's Colombia. Here's Panama. at this point in time, Panama is owned by Colombia. They are basically the same country. It's just the Panamanian government has a real power. So the U.S. supports a revolt that causes Colombia and Bogota to lose their power over Panama, and Panama's an independent nation. And part of the agreement, quote unquote, the agreement, is that they will allow the U.S. to have land rights through the Panamanian Canal. And here's the two options. Before the Panama Canal, you take Route A. You go all around the Atlantic Ocean, around all this area. You go through here, Cape Horn, where there's a lot of storms, and it's very nasty often, many times out of the year. And then you finally get to the Pacific Ocean. Or you go through here, go through Cuba, or go around the Caribbean, but mostly you're going to stick close to the land. And then you're out through Panama. Which one would you rather take and why? Well, you take the short route because it's cheaper. So this is the Panama Canal as it's being constructed, and there's some steamliners going through. And this is the technology that makes the Panama Canal work. If you were to look at Panama on like a globe that's textured, you'd notice that one side is much higher than the other. So how do you get water to go through it in a way that allows ships to pass? Well, you institute what's called locks. Locks are basically walled off areas where they can fill water in and allows ships to pass through. So look through this and you'll basically see how it works. You start with one, the ship goes in at a low water level. They lock it off on both sides and let the water fill in from the other side. At that point they become level and they go off. Now this is what it looks like today. Now to get through the Panama Canal, and one group that does it a lot are cruise ships. Cruise ships go through the Panama Canal because it's very much the pretty area. You're in the Caribbean. You don't want to go all the way around Cape Horn for a big long cruise. It would take weeks. So they use cruise ships to get them from one place to the other, often without passengers because they're just moving the cruise ships around. But it's tens of thousands of dollars to get through that Panama Canal. That's why it's still very expensive, but way, way, way less expensive than just going, and less dangerous than going all the way around South America. All right, so now let's talk about dollar diplomacy. So TDR, Teddy Roosevelt, his policy was big stick. Use your ability to basically be a debt collector and policeman of the world to engage in diplomacy. Taft took the opposite approach. He was like, well, we're not going to be weak on diplomacy, but let's encourage diplomacy and peaceful resolution through money. So basically his policy was he encouraged banks to loan money to Latin America and other countries, and by doing that, those countries would often have a positive view towards us, because here's how it would work. Let's say you're Argentina and you need money. So U.S. banks loan a bunch of money to Argentina. Well, if Argentina starts acting up and doing things that are rebellious or anti-American or anti-democracy, that might mean that they're not going to get any more money loaned to them by those banks. We're basically controlling them with our purse strings. We're controlling the flow of money to them. That's how we engage in diplomacy under dollar diplomacy from President Taft. So here's the quick few elements of dollar diplomacy through Taft. Improve financial opportunities for American businessmen because they could now invest in these South American countries. Use private capital to further U.S. interests overseas. So we're talking about private money, not public tax money. So that's another benefit. We're not talking about tax dollars here. And by doing this, the U.S. creates stability and order abroad to best promote America's commercial interests. So basically we're binding ourselves to these countries financially so they don't rebel, they don't fall apart. That way when something bad happens, the U.S. can have an in to go deal with the problem, but it also prevents problems from happening because they know that sweet, sweet American money is not going to come in if these countries decide to not be friendly to us.